Good evening, everyone, and welcome to episode 20 of Scotonomics. I'm William Thompson, and I'm joined, as always, by Kieran Van Sweeten. Hi, Kieran. How are you doing?
I'm good. Yep. How are you, William?
Yep, very well. Welcome to you, but of course, welcome to all of our viewers, including our relatively new viewers who are watching us on Facebook and on Twitter. We are still on Independence Live on YouTube, so welcome to all of you, and wherever you're watching us, and if you're watching us on Catch Up, hello to you as well.
Yeah. Hello, everyone.
So, what's top of your mind at the moment? What have you been up to this week?
Well, we had a busy morning this morning, didn't we, William? Because we were already talking about actually creating a film about the economics and the possible economics of an independent Scotland. So we have a very interesting guest lined up for that in Edinburgh, and we're going to go and meet him on Wednesday next week with the help of our filmmaker, Phantom Power. So that's really exciting.
Yes, really good. We've got one big interview in Edinburgh and one big interview in Barcelona in the next couple of weeks. So all around monetary sovereignty and the importance of currency, and a big discussion about what is money anyway and what is currency anyway, which I'm sure you'll all enjoy. Anything else you've been up to or want to mention before we get stuck into our fantastic video this evening?
Yeah, I mean, I've actually been out delivering some canvassing cards over the last little while, and I met a woman today who is convinced that Scotland is supported by our much larger neighbour and their taxes. So that was quite it's kind of expected, and it's something that we're busy trying to debunk and get people to understand how the fiscal monetary system actually works, isn't it?
Yeah. I thought about two things today. The first thing is we had a couple of people on Twitter yesterday say it'd be really good if we did something around the wind farms and what's happened with the recent decision by the Scottish government to rent out the sea for the next few years. I'd actually recommend a Commonweal podcast that's dedicated to that I think took place today. It's available now. We'll put a link in the show notes because it was really, really good and really useful. But it is something that we'd like to cover, but they've covered it. They've wrote a policy paper on it as well, so a lot of in-depth there, but really important. And the second thing is today I spent about 6 hours reading about and concentrating on the concept of green lairds. So the idea of these individuals and companies coming in and using the land in Scotland for carbon sequestration or for various other ways of earning money. So that was really interesting. I'm doing a big project on that. So fascinating. I'm sure we'll be covering some of that stuff in Scotonomics as we go forward. But tonight is all about one of our favourite subjects, everyone's favourite subject, their bank. So Kieran, do you want to just give us a little bit of an introduction in tonight's episode?
Yeah, so I read some time ago about pensioners queuing in the rain for mobile banking services in 2019, a report from which revealed that 396 bank branch closures occurred since 2015, and an additional 11 branches reducing their opening hours to just one per day. So at the same time, Scotland's chief executive said 500,000 people in Scotland over the age of 60 who do not use the internet are being left behind with the move to digital, the move to digital by default banking. So along with the reduction in free cash machines, this is making banking harder and harder for pensioners and increasing the likelihood that they will become victim to scams. So in 2021 also saw the closure of branches of the TSB and Virgin Money, which means that many in the lowlands and highlands and islands have to travel many miles to access a bank branch. But last year also saw more populated areas losing branches. So too, for example, Forest beside me, and also branches in Aberdeen. So, and also mobile banking services have been interrupted by the pandemic, exacerbating the problem. So this is not just a problem in Scotland, though, is it? It's also a problem in Spain, isn't it?
Yeah, I think it's a universal problem, to be honest. And, it was really interesting. Our conversation covered the States, and we were throwing in stuff from Scotland and the UK. But this is very pertinent to what's happening in Spain. So this is this is a campaign that's happening at the moment. So I'm old, not stupid. Spain's elderly criticise online banking. I'll put a link into those reports. But it's exactly the same thing as we know is going on in Scotland and the UK. We're expecting old age pensioners to to completely understand how to use an app on a smartphone to access their banking, and that's actually a huge issue for a whole number of people. And also there was issues around accessibility when banks are closing and they're just having the outside the kind of teller machine. People are struggling if they've got arthritis pressing the buttons. They can't put their payment books in, and it's a really interesting conversation for us to have about all of the services that we're losing from our high streets, and for the things that we've always thought would always be there and are so important. And I think the conversation from the States is really useful, and we got into a lot of detail about Scotland and America, as well as some of the other countries. So really good conversation. I'm looking forward to showing you all the episode.
Yep. So our guest tonight is Dr. Monique Morrissey, and she joined the Economic Policy Institute in 2006, and her areas of expertise are financial markets, labour markets, and retirement security. Monique has a PhD in economics and a BA in political science and history. So I hope you enjoy hearing from Monique today. Monique, welcome to Scotonomics, and thank you for coming onto our show to talk about bank desertification. In fact, it was reported this morning that the TSB will be closing 9 out of 9 of its branches, its Scottish branches, I should say. And however, this has been an ongoing process since 2008, and it's been most especially affecting more remote areas of Scotland, where we hear of our elderly folk queuing in the rain for mobile banks. However, this bank desertification is now affecting more populous areas. So you say in your Common Dreams article that politics and special interests are keeping the US Postal Service from becoming an affordable banking service. Is the US Postal Service still in the public sector then, Monique?
Yes, it is. That is one advantage we have over you in the UK and Scotland, is that at least technically our postal service, even though it operates a bit like a company, like a private corporation, is definitely still publicly owned. But it is being gutted a little bit from the inside through outsourcing. So there's sort of backdoor privatization, but the delivery itself and the main, it's still publicly owned.
So you suggest that if the US Postal Service started undertaking banking duties, this could actually be economically advantageous for them rather than onerous. And why do you say that, Monique?
Well, the main reason is that they have all these post offices. And I understand that in the UK, you have the post office, which was spun off of the Royal Mail, and that they have banking services. And for the same reason, if you already have to have post offices in every town and neighborhood, which is more or less, I mean, there are more post offices than than all even fast food franchises put together. So even little towns that have nothing else going on, they have a post office. And so they have to.
Wow, that's an amazing stat. That is an amazing stat for us looking at America.
Yeah, no, it's amazing. So they do have to have post offices everywhere, and it's also super popular. Everybody loves the post office. Rural areas love the post office especially, which is one of the reasons why, even though the United States has become very politically polarized, we're not polarized around the postal service. Very popular. Everybody, there's a lot of pushback when they try to close any of these branches. Now, if you're already staffing a bank branch and they are already doing financially sensitive things, like they already do a little bit of financial stuff, like you can post money orders and things like that. And we have a highly trained, clerks working at the Postal Service, very, very trusted. These are good jobs by and large, by American standards, which is not a very high standard, but nonetheless, people don't want to lose these jobs. People trust the workers there. So you already have this infrastructure, and it wouldn't really cost very much more to do basic banking services on top of that, and beyond what's already there. And there is a history of that. The United States did have postal banking until 1968. So anyhow, so the thing is that once you've already got the overhead and you're already having to have post offices, which is a good thing, all over the place, you might as well offer some basic banking services, especially as other, commercial banks are falling. They're not doing their jobs.
So the US Postal Service did do banking before. It was discontinued in 1967. So why did that happen?
Well, they would argue that because of lack of demand, it was very, very basic. In fact, it was kind of old school. It's quaint. People would actually put stamps in a bank book, as a savings mechanism. And so I think that the argument would have been that at the time, that particular model wasn't really, was losing, wasn't necessary. People, and also there was a period when bank branches were everywhere. And people, it didn't seem to be necessary anymore. But what we found is that it's more necessary than ever. I mean, we don't want to go back to the days when we're sticking stamps on a book, but we do want to go back to the days when you have face-to-face contact with a competent, trusted person who knows you in your little town. And we still have a lot of these. I used to work in a very, very small town in rural Virginia, and the postmistress, who only retired a few years ago, had been there for decades and decades, knew everybody. It was really hands-on. She would have helped any other older people, with whatever they needed. And I think that this is more, not less necessary than ever, because technology, and trust, the fears of technology and rational fears of technology and broadband access and all these other things make it very complicated for seniors in particular and rural people in particular to access online banking and all those services that people are so excited about, but I think are limited. And so, so I think that it's not less necessary, it's more necessary than ever to bring it back. And other countries maintain postal banking, as England did, and the UK in general, and other countries, Japan. I mean, there's many, many other countries that have maintained postal banking. We can get into this later, but what really happened also is that there was legislation passed in 2006 that severely limited what the Postal Service could do. So it was artificially constrained from expanding into these necessary services. Necessary, and by the way, you could bring in some fees that would help the Postal Service to provide work, and some revenue. But the main reason I think it should be done isn't to provide revenue for the Postal Service, but to provide necessary services.
It sounds to me as if the US government should have really invested in it then and created a gold standard for the banking system with its postal services that would have held up the private banks to a gold standard. I think they have that system in Germany as well. And you've explained, I was going to ask you about what the regulatory framework is that's preventing this from happening. You've explained that happened in 2006. So why is that happening? Why is that happening, Monique?
Well, there is a lot. So the 2006 legislation was mostly a disaster, and there hasn't been major legislation since then. Weirdly, there was some support from progressive Congress people at the time for the legislation. It had to do with the fact that at the time, deficit scares were big in Congress. Now, the Republicans have shown they really don't care about deficits, but at the time it was kind of a bludgeon for people. And the Postal Service had been overpaying for pensions. It's kind of a long story, but Congress wanted that money to keep flowing to the federal government in order not to show larger deficits. So they kind of reached this compromise where they said, keep pouring money at us, but we'll at least cause it to go towards retiree health benefits. And so people got bamboozled into this, and it turned out to be incredibly costly. And I don't know if it was done intentionally on the part of people, would-be privatizers in the right wing, but what the effect of this, of continuing to pour a lot of money from the Postal Service to the federal government for these retiree health benefits, was to make the Postal Service look like it was losing money, look like it was incompetent, look like it was backwards. Even though it was super efficient, it was paring itself to the bone. It was outsourcing like crazy, but it had this huge overhead. And at the same time that this was passed, they also, there had been a lot, and this was, years in the making, there had been a lot of behind the scenes lobbying by private competitors to limit what the postal services would do. So it was enshrined in this act that the Postal Service could only do these limited and traditional services. For example, they could sell postcards, and photocopying, very, very limited. And in addition to that, there's a regulator that was established called the Postal Regulatory Commission that just internally has this ethos of protecting the private sector at the expense of the public sector. So they really often, and they have leeway, but they tend to rule in favor of private corporations that say this is unfair competition. And as an economist, I can say that you want to worry about unfair competition when it will destroy competition, when it will do bad things to consumers. But in this case, this is good for consumers. There's no consumer argument for limiting what the Postal Service provides. There's all this overhead. it's not a competitive market. It costs very little to provide these services. It would be good for the Postal Service and good for the consumer. So there's really no reason to limit it, but it's sort of enshrined in this legislation and in the regulatory structure beyond what the legislation demands.
Monique, you've just given us two plays out of the privatization playbook there, which is what we're seeing in the United Kingdom with the National Health Service. And it is this, you throw loads of money at it and then you see it's not working, which is evidence that the private sector can do better. And then the second play is to say, well, actually, we're going to limit what you do and we'll allow the private sector and we'll give the private sector support to start stepping on your toes. And you were saying at the start that you're not sure if this was the plan or if it just happened, but I think I know what the plan would have been. It seems to be similar to the privatization, that's particularly, and as I'm sure you know, the United Kingdom is the global leader when it comes to privatization, but it seems to be the way to privatize services is by at least using two of those little tricks.
Yes. Yeah. And I want to clarify that there's no doubt that some of the privatization, what I call backdoor privatization, was intentional, was lobbied for, was the result of years of, closed door. There are these advisory committees that are private companies that then just advise the Postal Service. Well, you can imagine what their advice is. There's also this, it's a very, very strange thing when it comes to different kinds of outsourcing. One kind of outsourcing, the Postal Service is almost required to give the company that does the outsourcing the entire benefit of any cost savings. So the Postal Service doesn't even benefit from it. I mean, it's not even like you could see a situation where they, the outsourcing corporation pays very poorly, and whereas the postal workers are unionized, and so it wouldn't be good for the workers, and I would not support this, but at least it would save money. But for the Postal Service, and this is not even happening because the entire cost savings are rebated to these low wage outsourcing companies, so nobody wins. I mean, really, it's like it drives down labor standards. It doesn't save the consumer money. It doesn't help the Postal Service. The only people who benefit are low wage outsourcing companies. So it is a serious problem.
So you state as well in your article that many Americans face banking deserts and barriers to banking. Can you tell our audience more about this?
Yes. So people have tried to quantify this, and I think there are links in my article if people look it up to, attempts to say how many people are not within this many miles of a post office. I think that's important to show. I mean, I'm sorry, not a post office, of a bank branch. But I think that there are more. You can be, if you live in an area that has poor public transit and you don't have a car in the United States, you don't have to be in a rural area or in a neighborhood that's very, very far away. I mean, you could be 5 miles from a bank branch, but it's incredibly inconvenient. And, as we know, if you use somebody else's, ATM machine or whatever, the fees are really high. So what we're seeing in the United States is the privatization of a payment system. So people are increasingly paying just to access their own money, just to cash their own checks, just to, not even to borrow or to do anything that we think of as, the value added by the banking service that they're supposed to allocate resource. They're supposed to take your money and lend it out to some productive use and whatever. None of that. You are paying just to cash your government check or cash your paycheck. And most notoriously, this is done by, these predatory companies like paycheck lenders, these little outlets that are everywhere in the United States, very, very high costs, where they don't even want people to pay off the loans. They want people there forever, continue to pay, usually pay more than what they borrowed, double that, just continuing to pay. But even banks themselves increase a larger share of commercial banks of the supposedly, the not sleazy, non-predatory banks are also getting, a lot of their revenue now from overdraft fees, from ATM fees, from, just people trying to access their own money. And so this is a real failure. The payment system and people's ability to access their own money should really be a public service. I mean, whether you can have debates about whether or not, the public sector should be allocating loanable funds, and maybe they should partner with private sector, with credit unions to do that. But when it comes to just people being able to access their Social Security check, I mean, it's ridiculous that they have to pay a bank to do that, or worse, that they have to pay a check cashing outlet.
So when you're talking about banking fees in America, have you looked at how they compare with other countries? Are they particularly erroneous in America in comparison to other countries?
Actually, that's a good question. I don't know the answer to that, but they are very high. I mean, people who are unbanked or underbanked, people who underbanked means that you may have access to a bank, but you are still using check cashing outlets or other what they call alternative. It's a euphemism, but the predatory outlets, the alternative financial services, they pay often. So there are people who are living off of $10,000, $15,000 a year, below poverty, and they can pay 10% of their income easily in to these alternative financial services. I mean, that is just criminal. That is like it's horrific. I mean, these are people who are who have food insecurity. I mean, we do not have a robust, as you probably well know, I mean, the United States is notorious for not having a robust social safety net. And then on top of that, we are allowing people to be gouged by these exorbitant, usurious fees. And ironically, this is something that I used to study in, back in the day, and I don't pay as much attention to, but ironically, in the old days, a lot of the very conservative Southern states had usury laws that protected people because they were old fashioned. And, now they've mostly gone by the wayside, although there is still, what we find is that if you compare across states, there's this is not a competitive market. Like, the check cashing outlets, you can have them across the street from each other and they're charging the same fees. It does not reflect the risk of lending to people. It does not reflect the risk of opening these things. It's just a gotcha fee. Like they're just, and you can see this by looking at across states that have different laws, that they'll just abide by the law, but they have, they make plenty of money even where they're somewhat restricted. So, there's all kinds of indication that these are not competitive markets. These are gotcha, predatory markets.
I really like that gotcha phrase that you used in the article. And I think that will resonate with so many people. And what you also said in the article is the technology's there to not, old fashioned, when they could say to you 20 years ago, we didn't know you were going overdrawn and would cash that check. So you go, okay, fair, whatever it is. But now it's like the technology's there. These things should not exist. And these kind of got you charged.
And it's a vicious circle too, because what we found is that people who are unbanked or underbanked, who are afraid of getting, often what happened is they got gouged, and then they're like, well, I can't afford this. And you can imagine, you're paying, you if you have no money in the checking account and then you're paying a hefty fee for an overdraft and then you owe on that, you get yourself in worse trouble. And so a lot of people are just like, I can't deal with this. If they're living paycheck to paycheck, hand to mouth, which again, the United States does not have a, proper safety net, social safety net. A lot of people they just decide that they don't want to have anything to do with banks. So I think that this is important. It's not just people for whom it's incredibly inconvenient to go to a bank branch, but it's people who are afraid of banks and not just the predatory banks. But they would trust the Postal Service and they would go to the Postal Service and the Postal Service wouldn't charge these fees. Now, ironically, the Postal Service right now is charging overly high fees for check cashing in a pilot program. But I don't believe that they're really, under the current leadership, the Postal Service in the United States is genuinely trying to offer limited banking services. I think they're just going through the motions and then they're going to say, oh, it didn't work. But right now we're in the middle of a pilot program to try to, take very small baby steps towards bringing back postal banking. But the way it's set up, the fees are too high. It's just check cashing. The check limits are too low. It's not competitive. It's not helpful, and it's not being used.
Monique, you also state that these barriers disproportionately affect people of color. Why is this?
Well, I mean, I think, for all the reasons that you would expect, which is that people of color in the United States disproportionately are number among the low income, for the usual reasons that people of color pay more for services and live in greater poverty, more isolation, live in areas that have more services. There's also, I mean, I think that and we think of African Americans for that, but I think that Hispanics also, there are also like one of the reasons that people have trouble accessing banking services is that they don't have the proper, identification papers and stuff like that. And I'm not even just talking about people who may be working in this country without proper papers, but there are a lot of older people of color, Hispanics and Black, who don't have the 15 different kinds of, they may never even have had a birth certificate. And so this is actually a problem for voting, which is also a postal related problem. It's a problem for, that crosses many boundaries, that there are a lot of people in the United States, especially older people of color, whose paperwork is not, that there's slight anomalies, or they're lacking some paper. And, this has become an increasing problem. I don't know about you guys, but I've been helping my parents who are not in that, they're elderly, but they're not in that situation, but just try to, they moved recently into an assisted living. So just moving stuff around and having to enter 15 different passwords, and, being asked for random, literally birth certificates just to change their address on a bank, that kind of thing. I mean, there's so many people for whom this is really, really onerous. And it's, it's meant to protect people against online fraud. But we're not really protecting people against the things that really matter, but then we're making it really, really hard for people just to, open a bank account or change their address. Or, I mean, it's probably necessary, but it's one of the many reasons why not having in-person banks, with people who can help with that, because not everybody has. I mean, I live very close to my parents, but not everybody has that. And we're seeing it actually in a whole other world right now, which is, that we've seen our Social Security offices have been shut during COVID. And we saw this massive drop off in people being able to access disability benefits and things like that. So it really, really matters. Hands-on, face to face, for people in poor health, people with low incomes, people, and especially seniors, and especially in rural areas, having a physical presence, and predictable, with people who know you and are looking to help you, is absolutely essential.
It's very clear from what you're saying that, this situation that you have now, and that we are having increasingly in Scotland now as well, is this is interfering with your ability to participate in society, and most especially to participate in your democracy. And you stated in your article that maintaining a secure monetary system that serves as a store of value, a system of accounts, and a means of exchange is a quintessential government service. Are there any political champions in the US for this cause?
Yes. I mean, fortunately, this has gained steam. So I think that, I mentioned earlier that there's a pilot program for postal banking, but that's really just it's not really a pilot program. It's a joke. It's in 4 locations. I talked to one of them happens to be near my house. I went and talked to one of the clerks there. He said they'd had 2 people come and use it. And he suspected that both of those people were just testing the system rather than actually availing themselves of the thing. So, I mean, we don't have postal banking, but we've been, there's more and more support on the Hill, as we call Congress, in this, and some of the people that have been highly associated with this are Senator Elizabeth Warren, Senator Bernie Sanders. So you guys probably have heard of these people. There are big progressive stars. And one person who's a centrist but has been very much behind this is Senator Kristen Gillibrand. And then another senator who may not be a known name in the UK, but Senator Sherrod Brown, who's very progressive also. And Sherrod Brown he's expanded his concerns, he doesn't just want the post offices to provide basic banking services, but he also wants them to fix the payment system. So right now we have big banks that have this just in time, real time payment systems, and it's all privatized. Even the small banks can't access to it. And theoretically, the government is going to be providing this, but they've been really slow. And so Senator Brown really wants, he doesn't just want these face-to-face services at the post offices, but he wants everybody to be able to access, to access this low cost, free government provided payment system. It used to be cash. Increasingly, it's not cash, but everybody who wants to use digital bank, payments should be able to, and that should be a government service and not something that the big banks make for themselves and everybody else is paying overdraft fees unnecessarily and things like that.
So there are people who are looking at this and thinking, this is just crazy. You shouldn't be profiting from people accessing and paying for stuff. That's what the people who are buying, that's what, when you buy something, there's a profit there. There shouldn't be a profit just to give someone a profit.
No, I completely agree. I don't even talk about those things, but as we get more and more digital, that means more and more people, businesses are losing out, and that there's, they take a cut, right? I mean, every time you pay with credit, you're actually, paying for the service, just for the payment. And so, yeah, there is a problem. Mm-hmm. And, it goes beyond that. I mean, one of the things, as I think it's also happening in the UK, but I mean, Amazon has just taken over in the United States. And if you think about it, it's like people have a tendency to just say, well, it's okay for the public sector to do something if it was done historically. So that's why we like to emphasize that the Postal Service has done postal banking. It does it in many other countries. But if you really think about what Amazon does, it's a monopoly, and and a monopoly should be public. So if, I mean, Amazon can sell its own stuff fine. They can deliver their own stuff fine, but they're really providing access to hundreds of thousands of small sellers. And there's no reason why that should be a private. It's convenient. I use it. I'm ashamed of it. I don't like Amazon. And yet I order stuff through Amazon. I'm a busy working mother, and I don't, but this should be a public service. And we actually had before, now we have a very problematic leadership at the Postal Service right now, that, Trump appointed postmaster has scandal after scandal. Before that, though, we had, a board member who then prior to that was the oversight person at the Postal Service, who had a very, he's a former military, he's a very mainstream guy who's worked as, in government and in the private sector for many, but he said, the Postal Service should be looking at things like fresh food delivery, because they can go in your house and you trust them when you're gone. They should be looking at, and he had a very expansive view of all the things that would make absolute sense for somebody who is coming to your house every day, who you trust, who's like, here, a lot of the people, especially FedEx. So UPS is another big delivery service, and they are unionized. And I actually used to work for the union that represents those drivers. I mean, I trust them too, because those are good jobs. People don't want to lose them. But FedEx, I mean, those FedEx workers are not even considered workers in the United States. They've been misclassified as contractors. You don't want those people in your house. I mean, I think most of them are perfectly nice people, but this is a transient workforce, underpaid, desperate workforce. I mean, you don't want them having access to your house or to your mailbox or things like that. So, I think that we should think big. And I am not, I do think the private sector does some things a lot better, but there's, if we're delivering every day and we have this trust and we have this infrastructure, we have the postal, the post office network, we have the postal delivery network, and we have trust, we should be, thinking about ways that it makes sense for that, for the consumer, for the public, to provide more services, not just postal banking, but postal banking is the most obvious one.
Yeah, so it sounds to me as if your current postmaster is interested in perhaps making it into a private service. Do you think that that's the case? And I think that President Biden is looking to maybe try and get someone else into that position.
Well, it's going to be a challenge. So at least we've taken baby steps in that direction. President Biden has named 3 people to the board, and he's going to be naming 2 new people. And there was a fear for a while that he would name, inexplicably, was going to renominate somebody who's a big business, like a private equity Democrat, because who's got a lot of connections in the, I think the Democrats are sort of afraid of alienating all the financial, supporters. So he was going to be renominated. Also, the guy had some ties to the union movement, but he was a big supporter of the current scandal, the Trump appointee postmaster. So at least that's not happening, but nobody really knows what it will take to get this guy out of there, because he has to be removed for cause and nobody can see his contract. I mean, the Postal Service, even though it's public in the United States, it's been, it's set up a little bit like a private corporation, and that includes, employment contracts or whatever not being public. So that it's very strange. So nobody really, but yeah, we think that eventually he is going to get the boot. Oddly enough, I don't think that he wants the attention that would come with, even though former President Trump did have these commissions looking into formal privatizing. I think there's 2 different kinds of people in the United States who want to privatize the Postal Service. There's the ideologues, the libertarian ideologues, the think tanks. And then there's the private corporations. And often the private corporations kind of want to do it quietly. They don't really want, they wouldn't mind having the vestige or shell of the public sector doing some of the work, and then just, basically eating away at the Postal Service from the inside. The libertarians are really enamored of of the German model and the English model. They want to, to them, it's a name brand. It's like showing, they claim that the rationale for having a public postal service has disappeared. And often the corporations will support the libertarian think tanky, ideological stuff to a point, but there is a tension there, because the corporations mostly don't want to do this without any attention paid to them. And so our current postmaster, he's not somebody who goes around saying, I want to privatize the Postal Service. He just wants to keep business as usual and expand the outsourcing, the backdoor outsourcing of the Postal Service, which is where he comes from. That was his business before. He came from a logistics corporation that did massive business with the Postal Service. His whole appointment was very sleazy. I mean, it was not done in any normal fashion. And there's no doubt he kept stock in companies that, I mean, he broke all kinds of rules, but there were, they would find loopholes. Like they would say, well, he doesn't actually own stock in a company that does direct. I mean, there would be these like sort of one step removed. And so anyhow, he is very, very, very much in the business of trying to help these upstream outsourcers. But he publicly doesn't espouse wanting to privatize the Postal Service. Also because he's been under the gun. I mean, he's been so unpopular the whole time. He doesn't look to make additional enemies. And I'd also like to just say that the thing that has prevented the Postal Service, all the terrible things that have been tried to be done by the Postal Service, what's really helped is having the postal workers unions. And there are several. The two biggest ones are the ones that represent the clerks and the sorters, the American Postal Workers Union, and then also the national, the letter carriers. So the unions have really been what has stopped some of the, the worst private, but, again, it also wouldn't be, it's not been perfect and there are different interests there. And, but it is really important to have institutional bodies that have an incentive to protect the Postal Service as a public service. And that has been what, that plus the popularity of the Postal Service, even in what we call red state America, even in the conservative parts of the United States, have protected to date the Postal Service, and also make me hopeful about postal banking. It's unusual in that sense.
When the Brits think about capitalism and the country that most embraces the capitalist idea, we often think of the States. And I say to people that actually you should look much closer to home and see what the United Kingdom's like. And this is another perfect example of America hasn't dared to privatize its postal service. I think there's only 4 countries in the world who have privatized the postal service, and obviously the United Kingdom has to be one of them. It was kind of one of the final services that was privatized. But it was interesting because what you said there about it being a loved institution, it was in the United Kingdom and still is to an extent a loved institution, but that didn't stop us. And I liked your point about the power of the unions. I don't think it's a coincidence that our unions were watered down over a couple of decades to allow us to do things like removing the postal service. But my last question for you was around the kind of PR for post office and banking. Wells Fargo used to have a really good reputation in the States up until a few years ago when it was caught out, and just a completely nefarious scheme to defraud. How is the post office regarded in terms of its? I said you was trusted, but is that really measurable in how it's trusted as an institution to look after your money compared to the private banks?
Yeah, no, it is amazing. I mean, the post office is year after year after year shows up like 90% approval rating by Americans, like highest possible, approval rating, and very much across, it's not political. I mean, it's like people, and ironically, again, I mentioned this, is that it's very, very, very popular in rural America. So if you're in rural America, you probably, you're in a little small town, you don't have a pharmacy, so you're getting your medicine, you're getting, from the post, and, even though the Postal Service has been shrunk by this, what I call the backdoor outsourcing, like, it's over years, it's still, the face of American government. Door to door, people know their post, the postal carrier. People know the clerk at the store. I mean, I mentioned I know my postal clerk. So it is really important. Schools, the military, Social Security, and the Postal Service are all very popular because people interact with them, or they know, or they view it. It's sort of the patriotic part of government. So even though Americans tend to hate government in the abstract, they have this idea that there's some big government out there that's wasting money, giving it to foreign countries, or, because we don't like, we're very insular. Whatever. But when it comes to face with services that they know about, their kids in the military, or They love government, and this is one of the reasons why the ideologues, the think tanks that really, are very adamant about wanting to privatize it, is that they don't. It is very popular. It does make people hesitate about saying anti-government things. And actually, most government services are very popular. Most of the government, these services that I mentioned that are very popular. Again, we also have Medicare, which is the public, healthcare for seniors. Medicaid, which used to be kind of the I hate to say it, bastard stepchild, but it was the underfunded for low income people, but now it covers a lot more people. Also very popular. Social Security, very popular. Public schools are very popular. Americans tend to dislike government in the abstract, but love it in person. And at the top of that, love of their actual services is the Postal Service. And again, very much in rural areas. So you have strange bedfellows of people defending the Postal Service. And it often includes maybe not the most crazy wing of the Republican Party, but your congressman from Wyoming and places like that, they care, because otherwise if the post office shuts down in a small town, or they're going to hear about it immediately.
That's really interesting. So in the middle of the public who love the post office, love the postal service, and then on the other side you've got the multinationals or the companies who want to privatize that. In the middle you have the media. And I'm interested to see what's your perception of how the media covers this battle, because I just wanted to give you one quote from the TSB story that Karen started the show with. And the headline that accompanied these bank closures, it says, TSB announces closure of Scottish branches next year. Here's a list of locations. The bank will be closing 9 Scottish branches due to the rise in online banking. Now, that just proves to me that the media is just taking the narrative, because that could say for a desire to pay more returns to shareholders. But clearly the media is taking a role in this debate. Have you got any thoughts on that position in the States?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the media was very much complicit earlier on about painting the Postal Service as being financially troubled. So this was, again, after the 2006 Act that limited what the Postal Service could do, and did all kinds of, it created for a decade plus this idea that the Postal Service was, somehow inefficient and losing money, bleeding red, and instead of, mentioning that the Postal Service would have been profitable and was doing, super high tech, super, was very streamlined, doing all these things, they would just focus on it's losing money, even though the only reason it was losing money was because of this onerous requirement of very quickly pre-funding retiree health benefits. So that it was very much complicit in lazy reporting and bad reporting. Since then, what happened is then we had a president who was very anti-media, and scandal after scandal after scandal, and attacking the media. And he appointed this scandalous postmaster, So the coverage of the Postal Service recently has been much more positive. I mean, we have a good reporter, like in my local paper, the Washington Post, who follows it closely. The other thing is that I think the media has realized that the Postal Service is, because it's very popular and because there are a lot of postal workers. I mean, it's a huge employer, right? And these people are paying attention. I mean, postal union activists are the best people. I mean, it's just great talk. You have really strong advocate. People are paying attention. So even as our media has been gutted, and I love the fact that you guys have this program, but I mean, we are, for example, the New York Times labor reporter, who's great, left. I mean, it's kind of like the people with specific expertise and beats has been shrinking and shrinking and shrinking as fewer people subscribe to newspapers. So we have a media problem in the United States, and we have a problem of expertise and of reporters who know a beat and something in depth. Recently, I would say that coverage of the Postal Service has been relatively good, only because, again, it was a scandal. It was a scandal around, the guy, the current postmaster, having been appointed in this irregular fashion. It's a scandal, the fact that he had all these conflicts of interest. Is a scandal that they were trying to scare people from using mail voting in ahead of the presidential election. Even though it ended up working out okay, there's no doubt that they were trying to fearmonger around that and get people to not use the mail, and therefore hoping that the people who have more difficulty voting in person would just somehow, that day would happen and the weather would be bad or the buses wouldn't get there or whatever, and you'd have drop off among Democratic voters. So there was this concerted effort to make mail voting look bad. He played into that. There was huge mail slowdowns. Now he's got a new 10-year plan that's a service cut, just slowing down the mail intentionally. You guys have overnight mail. We now have it's not considered delayed if you're for some parts of the country to the other, if it's like 4 days later. I mean, it's, this is first class mail. So there's been, because he's been so scandal prone, we have had, I think, decent media coverage lately, but I think the damage was done with all this bad coverage of the supposed inefficiency of the Postal Service.
Yeah, that's definitely an issue that I hope that perhaps this program can do something to address.
Yeah,
so,
and I'm delighted to have learned about you guys. I didn't know about Scotonomics, and so I just think it's so great. We need something like that in the United States, and I'm definitely going to let people know about it. And thrilled that you guys are doing this, and also the depth with which you've done it. I've been on a few radio shows in the United States public radio where they talk about things at length, but mostly, it is a bit superficial. It's like, you got a 2-minute time thing. So you guys are covering all the different angles, and not just on this issue, but on a lot of other issues. And I think it's fantastic. So I'm very excited to have learned about Scotonomics, and I will be paying attention from now on. So,
oh, Monique, you've just given us a wonderful testimonial. I feel like sending you some money in the post, but I know it wouldn't get there, with all the problems that we've got. But that honestly, that was perfect. That means so much to us, because there's so much that we can learn in Scotland from across the globe. And what we find is that Scotland just looks south to England and continually just compares itself. And when you're comparing yourself to a country that's on the extremes of a neoliberal economy, then the things that you want to do seem so incredible. But when you look across the world and you see other countries, and America being this prime example of the country that you think is the most capitalist, but it's not got a privatized postal service. These are things that we think are really important. So we really appreciate your time to come on and explain that, what's a universal issue around affordable access to finance and to banking services.
America has become increasingly politically polarized, so that even though, it's incredibly scary what's going on in the United States and what the mistaken beliefs people have about, COVID, or, the craziness has floated to the top, and we're all seeing it. At the same time, the Democratic Party has become much more progressive. And so things like postal banking are actually more likely to get support than they would have. I mean, President Biden supports postal banking. So there is, on one hand, from my perspective at this progressive think tank, there's, it's scary to look in one direction, but it's hopeful to look in another direction, because at least we have a largely two-party system, but the left flank of the Democratic Party has really moved it to be much more visionary and much more, what's in the realm of possibility. We call it the Overton window has shifted, at least among Democrats, to the left, even as parts of the country have gone to, fascism, frankly. I mean, just crazy. And so, that's disheartening, but the progressive, and postal banking is an example of that. I think postal banking, has a shot now, and I wouldn't have thought so 20 years ago. So,
well, we've had that shift to the right, but we haven't had any kind of anything to shout about on the left. We have a little bit more in Scotland, but in the UK, I mean, our two parties are solidly neoliberal, solidly, and it's a kind of cigarette paper between the two of them. And a lot of the conversations you're having on fiscal deficits and investing and Green New Deal and stimulus packages, that conversation isn't even happening in the UK, never mind people having different views about it. It's not even on the agenda. So we're way behind you in terms of how you can use your currency and how you can use your economy and the real resources to create a better society. Not even on the agenda. So, it is, and in Europe, especially with the German government that's just been elected, and France and Italy, they're all talking about fiscal stimuluses and Green New Deals and investment. The UK, not a peep.
That's why Scotland matters, right? I mean, because you guys you're the left flank of the, I lived in England briefly when Thatcher was in office. I mean, I'm old, and I remember Scotland was, you guys didn't pay the poll tax. I mean, and since then you've been, I know that your hands are tied, but you also show that there's a different model and different support for things. I don't know, I don't follow it that closely, but I do know that Scotland is much more progressive in general than, and sort of. So anyhow, that's why what you guys do matters, is that it is a different model. So
really, I have got one question though. Just I know you're not in-depth knowledge of Scotland, but it would be great just to see, from an economics perspective and what you know about Scotland. do you think that Scotland would be able to survive, or would it thrive as an independent nation?
Given the Brexit craziness, that certainly is an additional argument for Scottish nationalism. So,
well, Monique, thanks so much for your time. We really appreciate it, and we're really pleased you were able to join us. Thanks very much.
Yeah, this was a real pleasure, and I look forward to hearing more about what you guys are doing. So I'm gonna, I don't know, subscribe or whatever it is that I need to do to make sure I hear about the topics you cover. So
thank you. Well, we'll make sure we drop you a date when we're going to go live with the show. But thanks again.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Monique. Thank you.
Wasn't she a lovely lady? And I think, and we must put her near the top of our our biggest fans as well. It was really nice, the things that she said.
Yeah. I think it's also, she makes a really valid point that, you know, we do go into depth and we do ask lots of questions about economics, and I don't think that really exists anywhere. Certainly not something that I saw on television as a child, I don't think.
Well, Julie's got a good idea. Americanomics. I think she's suggesting that Monica does. It was interesting because when we were doing that, when she was saying about what we were teaching her about Scotland, it was something that we spoke about afterwards, and we thought that's certainly a part of an objective of what we're trying to do for the show, is to show a much wider audience that Scotland is different, and we are looking at things differently. And remember, hey, we're not the same as the United Kingdom. And I thought it was really good that she said Scotland matters, and you do differently, and we're perceived as being much more progressive and on the left. And she mentioned Brexit as well. So, you know, the international community is aware that we are different, and we want to have the opportunity to vote for independence. And I think it's important that we get that message out as much as we possibly can. So please do share that episode with the people who you might not think would be that interested in Scotland, a little bit wider than maybe just your friends and family in Scotland.
Yeah. What I also really liked about Monique, I mean, she talks at a rate of knots, so it's quite an information dense episode as well. But also, she's incredibly passionate about social justice. You really get that from when she's talking about the bank charges and the people being able to access their benefits. It's really important. It's really, really important points.
Yeah, and as we said at the start, universal points as well. That we can really relate to. I just put in here about the post office because I just went online and I could remember how bad it was. But there you go. I think it was 750 million. It's a couple of hours after the post office floated. That was the difference between what speculators had paid for the shares and what they were valued at a few hours later, and it was an absolute disaster from every perspective. I mean, we covered it there. What happened to get it to that point? You know, how much money was given to it and then taken away from it, allowing the other suppliers to come in and take a lot of the services over to make it look like it wasn't able to do them. All the issues with strikes, and there was so many things that were done there to kind of undermine the organisation ready for privatisation, and it did what it was designed to do. It made a lot of money for people who were already wealthy, and that is the rationale of privatisation. And don't believe it's to do things better, because that's just the smoke and mirrors of it. It is to pull the commons into private hands.
Absolutely. And, you know, the thing is for people up in Inverness, I mean, I was listening to someone talk about that the other day, you know, I mean, the postal system up there is terrible. You know, they're having a real problems getting things delivered up there. And, you know, it's that typical cherry picking thing that's going on with that. It's interesting as well that she was talking about the different perceptions about public and private in America, where, you know, the government is sort of seen as sort of quite frequently as a universal badge, but of course people don't really equate it with Medicare, you know, the post office, the military, all the things that are, you know, really quite essential. So, I think it's an interesting observation that she makes about that, I think.
Yeah, I really enjoyed watching it through. Well, that's about all we've got time for tonight. Thanks so much for your engagement as ever and your comments. We are on Patreon, and you're able to support us, but also access a lot of our content earlier and some content just for you. And there's a few other benefits as well to being one of our patrons, and I'm just going to put that up there. Oh no, that's not it. Or someone's changed my banner. Someone changed my Scotonomics banner. I think that was Kevin from Independence Live. I'll drop the link as always to our Patreon in the show notes. Our episode next week on community wealth building, Kieran.
Yeah, that's going to be really interesting. It's something I'm particularly interested in, and you know, that thing of subsidiarity, which is at the heart of our belief in independence for Scotland. But you know, we want to see more subsidiarity after that as well. So, yeah, really good episode.
Yeah, a really good episode. We've actually got on our Patreon, we've actually got a full hour. There you go. See, I bet you didn't even see me doing that. We've got a full hour interview on the Patreon, and we've cut it down to about 45 minutes for the live broadcast. But it is fascinating, and what we cover in that, a lot of depth into some of the anchor institutions that underpin our communities, and we touch on privatization and so much. We go into there. It was a really, really interesting interview, and we look forward to that one. It's an interview with Neil McEnroy, isn't it? Neil McEnroy from the Democracy Collaborative. Yeah. So really good. And next week we'll let everyone know the episodes that we've got for the rest of February. And we've got some absolute crackers coming up. So thanks very much for joining us again tonight. If you're catching on catch up, I hope you do, and I hope you did enjoy the show. And please do share and let other people know about Scotonomics.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, thanks for joining us, everyone.
Thanks. Thanks for the comments as well. And until next week, we'll see you later.
Good night.